In the middle of a frozen valley in Montana, an old woman sat alone in her cabin, her husband gone, her sons taken by war, and her only companion, a loyal German shepherd named Rex. That night, the storm was unlike any other. When the fire died and hope faded with it, Rex disappeared into the blizzard. She thought she'd lost the last piece of her family, until he came back with something that would change everything. What happened inside that cabin wasn't just survival, it was a miracle. Stay until the end, you won't believe what she discovered when the dawn finally broke. If this story touches your heart, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video so more people can feel the warmth of faith, love, and God's light in the coldest places. Thank you for watching, and may God bless you. The wind swept across the desolate plains of Montana, dragging with it a bitter cold that seemed to cut through bone and silence alike. Snow lay heavy upon the fields, stretching endlessly toward the mountains in the distance, where the peaks were hidden behind thick curtains of fog. The old wooden cabin stood alone at the edge of a frost-bitten meadow, its roof sagging under the weight of snow, smoke curling weakly from its chimney. Inside, the faint orange glow of a fireplace trembled against the dark wood walls, painting everything in soft, flickering light. Margaret Maggie Turner, a 72-year-old woman with silver hair tied in a neat bun, sat near the window, her frail hands wrapped around a chipped porcelain cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Her skin was pale and thin like parchment, crossed by fine wrinkles that told stories of laughter, grief, and time. Her eyes, a faded shade of blue once bright with hope, now held the quiet melancholy of someone who had seen too much leaving and too little returning. She wore a thick knitted shawl draped over her shoulders, and though her body seemed fragile, there was still an air of endurance about her, the kind forged not by strength, but by the refusal to surrender. Outside, the wind howled like a lost soul. Maggie's gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the snow seemed to merge with the sky. She had lived in this cabin for more than 40 years, first with her husband Thomas Turner, a tall and broad-shouldered man with hands like rough oak bark and a voice that always carried warmth even in the coldest winter. He had served in World War II, returned with scars that ran deeper than flesh, and spent the rest of his days building this home for their family. The cabin had once been filled with noise, the laughter of 3 boys, the barking of a puppy, the creak of wooden floors under running feet. Now, it was only her and the whispering wind. By the fireplace, Rex, her loyal German shepherd, lay curled on an old rug. The dog was large, nearly 10 years old, with a coat of black and tan fur that had dulled slightly with age. His amber eyes gleamed with alertness, scanning the shadows as though protecting his small world from unseen dangers. Rex had belonged to Sam, her youngest son, who had left for the war in Afghanistan and never returned. Since that day, the dog had never left Maggie's side, as if understanding that his duty had changed, no longer guarding a soldier, but guarding a mother's fragile heart. He would follow her to the porch every morning, lie beside her as she knitted, and nudge her hand gently whenever tears began to fall. The old clock on the wall ticked steadily, its sound echoing through the quiet house. Maggie rose slowly from her chair, her knees stiff from the cold. She moved toward the table where 4 framed photographs stood. Dust had gathered around them, but she polished them often enough that the faces remained clear. Thomas in his uniform, his proud smile barely hiding the fatigue in his eyes. Michael, the eldest, strong-jawed and confident, who had joined the Marines like his father. David, the quiet middle child who loved drawing and went off to Vietnam with a sketchbook in his pocket. And Sam, her youngest, with that boyish grin and a restless light in his eyes. Maggie reached out and adjusted each photo, her fingertips trembling as they brushed against the cold glass. Then she struck a match and lit 4 candles in front of them, one for each of the men who had once filled this home. The flames flickered gently, their reflections dancing across the framed smiles. The scent of melting wax mingled with the faint aroma of pine wood smoke, and for a moment, it felt as though time had slowed, holding its breath in reverence. She spoke softly, her voice almost a whisper. "You left me piece by piece," she said, "but this house still remembers you. Every board, every window. They keep your footsteps." Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. She had cried too many winters for tears to still come easily. Rex lifted his head, ears twitching. The wind rattled the window pane, and a gust blew through a crack near the sill, making the flame of one candle tremble. Maggie pressed her hand against the cold glass and watched the storm outside. "You see that, boy?" she murmured to Rex. "Your master would have said it's just another Montana morning." The dog's tail thumped softly against the floor, and he let out a quiet sigh, as though agreeing. From the mantel, Maggie picked up a small wooden music box carved with the initials S.T., Sam Turner. She turned the tiny handle, and the faint melody of "You Are My Sunshine" filled the air, crackling slightly like an old memory reborn. Her lips curved into a thin, trembling smile. That song had been Sam's favorite when he was a child. He would sing it while feeding Rex, long before the wars, before the silence. The fire popped loudly, startling her from her thoughts. She added another log, and sparks jumped toward the chimney. For a moment, she could almost hear Thomas's deep voice saying, "Don't forget to stack the wood tight, Maggie. Wastes less heat that way." She smiled faintly, remembering how his hands, rough from years of carpentry and labor, had always been gentle when they touched her shoulder. He had been her anchor, and when the world took him first, she learned to stand against the wind alone. A knock echoed, faint, like a memory. But it was only a branch striking the door in the storm. Maggie looked at the latch, her heart beating just a little faster, before she laughed quietly at her own foolish hope. No one came here anymore. The nearest town was miles away, and most neighbors had long moved south. She turned back toward the photographs, her voice soft. "I keep thinking someone might walk through that door. Isn't that silly?" Rex tilted, his head, as if listening to her confession. The room dimmed as clouds thickened outside, swallowing what little daylight remained. Maggie poured herself another cup of tea from the old kettle, now barely warm, and sat down again beside the window. The blizzard was growing stronger, and the world beyond the glass had vanished into white. She watched it without fear, just quiet acceptance. Each winter felt like another test of endurance, but she had already faced worse storms than snow. Rex moved closer, resting his head on her knee. She reached down and stroked his fur slowly, her fingers sinking into the warmth of his coat. "You're a good boy," she whispered. "You've kept your promise." The dog's eyes blinked lazily. His body relaxed, but his ears stayed alert, a soldier still standing guard. As evening crept in, the candles burned lower. The photographs glowed softly in their light, and the cabin seemed to breathe, alive with the echo of memories. Maggie leaned back in her chair, eyes half closed, the music box tune still echoing faintly in her mind. The wind outside screamed across the plains, yet inside there was peace. a fragile, fleeting piece carved out of loneliness and love. The camera, if one could imagine it, would slowly pull away from the aging woman and her loyal dog, from the flickering lights that fought against the storm, until the cabin became a small, glowing dot swallowed by an ocean of snow. And in that vast silence, only Maggie's whisper lingered. They're gone one by one, but their warmth still lives here. The morning after the storm was eerily still. Snow clung to the window ledges, and the air inside the cabin felt frozen in time. Maggie Turner moved slowly through the kitchen, her breath forming faint clouds in the cold air. She wore a thick wool cardigan and a faded blue apron, her steps heavy but steady. The fire had long gone out, and only faint streaks of sunlight filtered through the frosted glass. Rex followed her closely, his paws silent on the wooden floor. The German shepherd's fur caught glimmers of light, revealing streaks of gray around his muzzle, a reminder that he too had aged beside her. His eyes, however, remained as sharp and loyal as the day Sam brought him home. Maggie began cleaning the counter, wiping away a thin layer of dust that had settled overnight. Her hands paused when she reached the far corner of the shelf. There sat a small wooden box, carved with delicate floral patterns. It was old, its hinges slightly rusted, and the wood carried the faint scent of cedar and thyme. She hesitated before opening it, as though touching the past might make it vanish completely. When the lid creaked open, the soft glow of morning light revealed its contents, a handful of keepsakes that held the weight of a lifetime. Inside lay Michael's Marine insignia, worn and scratched from the years of war. David's small sketchbook, its pages yellowed but still filled with pencil lines that captured mountains, rivers, and faces from distant lands. And Sam's silver dog tag resting beside a thin leather cord, the one he used to wear before leaving for Afghanistan. Maggie picked up the cord, her fingers trembling as she rubbed the worn metal between them. The sound of the wind outside seemed to fade, replaced by something softer, laughter echoing faintly from years long gone. Her mind drifted back to a summer day 2 decades earlier. The sky had been blue, the grass alive with sunlight, and her 3 boys were running across the yard. Thomas stood by the porch, tall and broad, his strong hands resting on his hips as he called out to them, "Easy there, don't let the pup knock you over." Sam, barely 12, was chasing a clumsy German shepherd puppy, a young Rex, all oversized paws and boundless energy. Michael, already in uniform, laughed as he watched his youngest brother trip and fall, only to be smothered in wet dog kisses. David, quieter and more thoughtful, was sketching the scene from under the old oak tree, his dark hair falling into his eyes as he worked. Maggie remembered how the sun caught in their laughter, how the world had felt so full of life that day. In the memory, she was younger too, her auburn hair tied loosely behind her head, her skin still glowing with the warmth of youth and sunlight. She had stood at the kitchen window, apron dusted with flour, watching them play. That was before the wars, before the silence that would replace the laughter. The sound of the puppy barking had once filled the cabin. Now, it was Rex's slow breathing that reminded her she was not entirely alone. The clatter of a cup slipping from her hand snapped her back to the present. The porcelain shattered against the floor. Rex immediately stood, tail lowered, his ears twitching at the sound. Maggie exhaled, kneeling down to pick up the pieces. "It's all right, boy," she murmured softly. "Just my clumsy hands again." She placed the broken shards aside and turned back to the table. Her gaze fell upon the open box once more. She picked up David's sketchbook and flipped through the pages carefully. Inside were scenes of the Montana countryside, quick portraits of his brothers, and a drawing of their father standing tall beside an old truck. Toward the end of the book, one page stopped her. It was an unfinished sketch of her. He had drawn her face but hadn't yet finished the eyes. Beneath the half-finished lines were faint pencil marks. For Mom. To finish when I come home. Maggie pressed the page to her chest, her shoulders trembling as she closed her eyes. The air in the cabin felt heavier now, filled with the weight of memories pressing against her heart. She returned the sketchbook carefully, but when she reached for Sam's dog tag again, something caught her attention. A folded letter beneath it. The paper was old, the ink faded, addressed simply, "For Mom." She recognized Sam's messy handwriting immediately. Her breath hitched. She didn't open it, not yet. Her heart wasn't ready. Instead, she placed it back, her thumb brushing across his name one last time. "Soon, my boy," she whispered. Rex nudged her elbow gently, his warm nose grounding her in the present. She smiled faintly, patting his head. "You miss him too, don't you?" she said. The dog tilted his head, eyes glimmering with a kind of understanding that transcended words. The kettle on the stove began to rattle slightly as the last of the snow melted off the roof, dripping into the metal gutters outside. Maggie rose, poured herself another cup of tea, and sat by the window once more. Outside, the world was silent, a vast field of white stretching endlessly beneath the morning sun. But inside her mind, it was alive with the echoes of laughter, the clinking of dishes, the sound of her boys arguing over who would feed the puppy first. As the chapter of memory closed in her heart, Maggie took one last look at the box before shutting its lid. She whispered softly, "I'll keep them safe, just as I promised." The wind outside seemed to soften, as though carrying her words to the ones who could no longer hear them. Rex lay down at her feet again, his tail curling near the old rug. The fire had yet to be rekindled, but somehow the cabin didn't feel as cold. Afternoon light spilled faintly through the frost-covered windows, turning the small cabin into a mosaic of gold and shadow. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the snow that blanketed the fields. Maggie Turner sat in her armchair near the fireplace, her knitting forgotten on her lap. The room smelled faintly of pine and smoke. Rex lay on the floor by the hearth, his ears flicking occasionally at the crackle of the fire. The old German shepherd had grown restless that morning. He kept pacing, his nails clicking softly against the wooden boards, as though something beneath the floor was calling to him. Maggie watched him curiously. "What's the matter, boy?" she asked, her voice roughened by age and years of talking mostly to the wind. Rex looked at her, then back to the floor near the corner of the room. He began pawing at a particular plank, his claws scraping until a faint creak echoed. Dust rose from the cracks. Maggie frowned, leaning forward. That section of the floor had always been uneven, but she had never paid it much attention. With effort, she set her knitting aside and knelt beside the dog. The boards were old pine, worn smooth by decades of footsteps, but now she noticed one loose edge. She pressed against it. It shifted slightly. Heart beating faster than it had in years, she fetched a small iron poker from beside the fireplace and carefully pried the plank upward. A faint scent of old paper and dust wafted out. Beneath the board was a shallow compartment, barely big enough to hold a small tin box wrapped in a yellowed cloth. Maggie's breath caught. "Sam," she whispered, recognizing the initials scratched into the metal. S.T. Her trembling hands lifted the box. It was lighter than she expected. She carried it to the table and brushed the dust away, her fingers tracing the familiar letters. Rex sat beside her, watching intently, tail still but eyes alert. When she opened the lid, the hinges groaned softly, revealing a bundle of envelopes tied with a fraying string. Each was addressed to Mom. Her throat tightened. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable, hurried, uneven, full of life. She untied the string and pulled the first letter free. The paper crackled as she unfolded it. "Hi, Mom," the first line read. "Rex is doing fine. The guys in my unit love him. They call him Sergeant Tail because he won't stop wagging it." A weak laugh escaped her lips. She could almost hear his voice, bright, teasing, full of youth. Sam had always been that way. Even as a boy, he was restless, with sandy blonde hair that never stayed combed and a smile that could melt her anger no matter what trouble he'd caused. When his father, Thomas, passed, Sam took it the hardest, though he never showed it in front of her. He hid grief behind jokes, behind his stubborn insistence that he would make Dad proud. He enlisted at 19, leaving home with his duffel bag slung over one shoulder and Rex, then just a year old, trotting loyally beside him. Maggie unfolded another letter, her eyes scanning quickly through the words. Each one painted a picture of faraway places, sandstorms, laughter among soldiers, nights spent under unfamiliar stars. "Don't worry about me," he had written. "Rex would bite anyone before they get near me. He's like my shadow." Her voice trembled as she whispered, "My brave boy." Tears welled, but did not fall. The third letter was different, shorter, the handwriting more uneven. "Mom," it began, "if you're reading this, something may have gone wrong. Don't cry for me. I want you to remember that Rex was always meant for you. He's family. Promise me you'll keep him by your side. He'll protect you, just like I wanted to." The candlelight flickered across her face as she finished reading. Her hands shook. The letter slipped from her fingers, landing softly on the table. Rex moved closer, resting his head on her lap. The warmth of his fur soaked into her trembling palms. She bent forward slightly, tears finally spilling down her cheeks, wetting the dog's ears. "Oh, Sam," she whispered. "You always knew I'd be alone." For a long while, neither moved. The fire crackled gently, the only sound in the room. Maggie's eyes lingered on the last letter, still unopened. She hesitated, then reached for it. Inside was a small photograph. Sam standing in front of a dusty military truck, his arm around Rex, both smiling toward the camera. The boy looked so alive, so full of hope that her chest ached. On the back of the photo, in faint ink, was written, "For the day we see each other again." She pressed the photo against her heart, closing her eyes. The wind outside had softened to a quiet hum, as though the world itself was listening. "You kept your promise, Sam," she said softly. "He's still here. He never left me." Rex gave a low whine, sensing the sorrow in her voice. His tail brushed lightly against her foot, a small, comforting motion that felt almost human. As night began to fall, Maggie gathered the letters and placed them back in the tin box, now no longer hidden. She set it on the mantel beside the family photos, between Thomas and Sam's portraits. The candlelight shimmered across the glass, reflecting both faces. "Now you're home," she whispered. Rex lifted his head, ears perked toward the sound of her voice. Maggie smiled faintly and reached down to pat his head. "Good boy," she said. "You brought him back to me." The dog's eyes blinked slowly, content. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle and slow, blanketing the world in white. But inside the cabin, warmth glowed from the fire and from something deeper, something finally at peace. By the time dusk crept over the Montana Valley, the sky had turned a bruised shade of gray. The air was heavy with the kind of stillness that always came before a storm. Maggie Turner sat near the window, sewing a patch on Rex's worn blanket. The flickering glow of the oil lamp threw soft shadows across her lined face. Her movements were slow, careful, each stitch guided by years of quiet endurance. Outside, the wind began to howl faintly through the trees, rattling the shutters. Rex, lying by the hearth, lifted his head. His ears twitched, muscles tensing under his thick black and tan fur. Maggie noticed his sudden alertness. "You feel it too, don't you?" she murmured. The old German shepherd whined low in his throat. He had always sensed storms before they came, long before the radio or sky could warn her. She stood, wrapping her shawl tighter around her frail shoulders, and peered out into the gathering dark. Snowflakes had begun to fall, slow and lazy at first, then faster, heavier, swirling like ghosts in the wind. She moved to check the woodpile near the door, only to find it nearly empty. "Oh dear," she whispered. There were only a few logs left beside the stove, not enough to last through the night. She had meant to gather more that morning, but her mind had been elsewhere, in letters, in memories, in voices long gone. Rex followed her gaze, then looked toward the back door. When the first rumble of thunder rolled across the valley, Maggie felt the cold seep through the cracks of the cabin walls. She stirred the embers in the fireplace, but the coals were nearly spent. The oil lamp flickered once, twice, and then went dark as the power lines beyond the ridge gave way to the storm. The room sank into shadows, lit only by the dying fire and the dim silver of snowlight filtering through the windows. She bent low, her hands shaking as she tried to coax the embers back to life with the last handful of kindling. "Come on now, don't go out on me," she muttered. The flame sputtered but refused to rise. The cold tightened its grip, creeping up her fingers, biting through the wool of her shawl. Rex stood suddenly, moving toward the door. "Rex, no!" she said sharply, but he was already scratching at the wood, barking once, not loud, but insistent. Before she could stop him, he pressed his body against the door, pushing it open just enough to slip through. The wind roared in, carrying a flurry of snow that swept across the floor. Maggie stumbled forward, clutching the doorframe as the storm bit at her skin. "Rex!" she cried, her voice nearly drowned in the wind. "Come back, boy." But the dog was gone, swallowed by the white. For a long moment she stood there, breathless, staring into the swirling storm. Her eyes searched the darkness, her heart hammering in her chest. The wind howled through the trees like a chorus of old spirits. She shut the door with effort, bolting it against the cold, then collapsed into her chair. Her frail hands trembled as she held them near the fading embers. "Please, God, keep him safe," she whispered. Minutes dragged into hours. The blizzard grew worse. Snow piled against the windows, and the cabin groaned under the weight of the wind. Every few minutes, Maggie called out, "Rex! Rex, come home!" Her voice cracked, then broke entirely. Her throat burned from the cold air, but she kept calling, even when she knew no one could hear. Then, just as the last ember died, a sound reached her ears. Faint at first, like the crunch of snow beneath paws. She froze, listening. "Rex?" she breathed. The scratching came again, this time louder, followed by a muffled bark. She rushed to the door, flinging it open. There he was, Rex, his fur caked with snow, his sides heaving from exertion. Between his teeth, he carried something bulky wrapped in frost. Maggie's eyes widened. It was a bundle of firewood, old but dry, likely dug out from behind the shed where her husband used to stack the winter reserves. The dog dropped it at her feet, tail wagging weakly, his breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. "Oh, my brave boy," she whispered, tears spilling freely now. She pulled the bundle inside, slammed the door shut, and fell to her knees beside him. Her hands moved automatically, feeding the logs into the fireplace. Within minutes, a new flame bloomed, strong, golden, alive. Warmth filled the cabin once more, chasing the darkness to the corners of the room. Rex collapsed beside the fire, his body shivering as the heat began to seep into his fur. Maggie fetched an old towel and rubbed him dry, whispering softly between breaths, "You silly, wonderful boy. You found what I couldn't." She pressed her forehead against his, closing her eyes. "Sam must have guided you." The firelight glowed against their faces, the old woman's wrinkled skin, lined by loss yet illuminated by love, and the loyal dog's weary eyes, still bright with purpose. She smiled faintly, tears glistening. "My son kept his promise," she said. "You're his heart still watching over me." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, warmth pulsed like a heartbeat. Maggie sat back in her chair, Rex resting his head on her knee. Together they watched the fire dance, its light reflecting in both their eyes. Two souls bound by love that refused to fade. And though the wind screamed against the walls, it could not breach the peace that had settled between them. When the storm finally broke, silence fell over the valley like a soft blanket. The night's fury had spent itself, leaving behind a world reborn in white. The snow outside the cabin shimmered under the pale light of early dawn, untouched and pure. Inside, the air still carried the faint scent of smoke and pine, the last trace of the fire that had burned through the night. Maggie Turner sat near the window, her frail hands resting on the arm of her chair, a wool blanket draped across her knees. Her face was calm now, the deep lines softened by the warm glow that spilled through the frost-lined glass. She could see her breath in the air, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel cold. Rex lay curled beside her chair, his breathing steady and slow. The German shepherd's fur was still slightly damp from the night before, but his eyes followed her every movement with quiet devotion. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to glowing embers, yet the cabin seemed filled with warmth. A different kind, not from wood or flame, but from something within. Maggie leaned forward slightly, the chair creaking beneath her, and reached down to touch Rex's head. "You did well, my boy," she said softly. "You brought the light back." The dog lifted his head, pressing it gently into her palm. His eyes, deep and amber, reflected the first hints of sunrise that crept across the snow outside. As she sat there, the soft light began to spill further into the room, catching on the framed photos that lined the mantel, Thomas in his uniform, Michael's confident smile, David's sketchbook propped open beside them, and Sam's photograph next to the tin box of letters. The sunlight danced across the glass, and for a brief moment, the faces seemed alive again. Maggie stood slowly, gripping the armrest for balance. Her joints ached, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. She walked to the door, opened it, and stepped onto the small wooden porch. The cold air bit at her cheeks, but the wind was gentle now, brushing against her skin like a whisper. Rex followed her, his paws leaving soft impressions in the snow. The valley stretched before them, endless and silent. The mountains to the west caught the first rays of gold, their icy peaks glowing against the morning sky. A few birds, small and dark, cut across the pale expanse, signs of life returning. Maggie drew her shawl tighter and sat on the porch step, breathing in deeply. "Your father used to say mornings like this meant new beginnings," she murmured, her eyes tracing the horizon. He wasn't wrong. The sound of footsteps on snow startled her for a moment. She turned and saw a figure approaching from the road, a man bundled in a thick brown coat and fur-lined hat. His gait was careful, steady. When he drew close enough, she recognized him, Mr. Harris, the postman from town, one of the few remaining neighbors who still visited despite the long distance. He was in his late 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a graying beard that framed his weathered face. His kind eyes always held a mix of curiosity and concern, the look of a man who'd seen too much loneliness in others but never lost his own quiet kindness. "Mornin', Mrs. Turner," he called out, his voice carrying over the snow. "Did you make it through the storm all right?" She smiled faintly. "Just barely," she replied, her voice calm but warm. "We managed." He nodded, stepping closer. "That's good to hear. Roads are still bad, but I thought I'd check on you anyway." He glanced at Rex, who was watching him with cautious eyes, tail swishing once. "Still got your guard dog, I see." "Always," Maggie said softly. "He's my hero now." Mr. Harris smiled at that, pulling off his gloves to reveal rough, calloused hands. "Well, looks like you've got plenty of company. Wish more folks had that kind of loyalty around here." He paused, then reached into his coat pocket. "Almost forgot. Found this mixed in with yesterday's mail before the lines went down. Thought it might be something you'd want." He handed her a small envelope, yellowed slightly by time. Maggie took it carefully, her hands trembling just a little. The handwriting was familiar, not Sam's but Thomas's. Her heart clenched. "Where did you find this?" she asked quietly. "It must have gotten misplaced years back," Harris said, shifting his weight awkwardly. "Came through one of those military archives in town. I saw your name and figured it belonged home." She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Thank you," she whispered. He tipped his hat politely. "You take care, ma'am." With that, he turned and made his way back through the snow, his figure shrinking against the white horizon. Maggie stood there for a long time, the envelope in her hand, the morning sun warming her face. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she looked down at Rex, who sat faithfully beside her, tail brushing the porch boards. "Another message from the past," she said softly. "Seems they all find their way back to me eventually." She finally tore open the envelope. Inside was a single page, written in her husband's steady hand. "If you ever find yourself alone, remember, love doesn't vanish, Maggie. It changes form. It becomes the light in the morning, the warmth in the fire, and the loyalty in those who stay." Her eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling now. A real, quiet smile. She folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest. "You're right, Thomas," she whispered. "It never really leaves." The wind rustled softly through the trees, and for a moment it seemed to carry the echo of familiar laughter. Her boys, her husband, all of them woven into the world around her. Rex leaned into her leg, and she rested a hand on his head, watching the sun climb higher. As the light spread across the snow, the cabin stood like a beacon, small, weathered, but alive. A thin line of smoke rose from the chimney, curling into the bright sky. It was a picture of endurance, of love that had survived every storm. And in that stillness, Maggie closed her eyes and whispered, "They took much from me, but not this. Never this." When the first light touched Maggie's cabin, it wasn't just the sun rising, it was grace itself. After years of sorrow, loneliness, and silence, warmth returned not only to her home, but to her heart. That morning wasn't about survival, it was about a promise kept. The promise that love never truly dies, that even in our darkest winters, God still sends a little light to remind us we are not alone. Sometimes, miracles don't come with thunder or angels. They come softly, through a loyal dog bringing firewood, a forgotten letter found at the right moment, or the peace that descends after a long night of pain. Maggie didn't just find warmth, she found God's gentle whisper, telling her that her family's love, her faith, and her endurance were never in vain. And maybe that's the lesson for us too. Life can take away much. People we love, dreams we built, time we'll never get back. But faith can turn loss into light. Every sunrise, every act of kindness, every moment you still choose to love despite the pain, those are the small miracles we live by. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect. Maybe whisper a prayer for someone you've lost, or for someone who still waits for light in their storm. And if you believe, as Maggie did, that God's love finds us in the quietest places, say Amen in the comments below. Share this story to bring a little warmth to someone else's day. Comment your thoughts. Tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel for more life-changing, faith-filled stories. And may God bless you and keep you today and always.